After 1918, the peace agreements divided the former Ottoman territories in the Middle East into British and French mandates. Britain became responsible for mandatory Palestine, but governing this region proved to be extremely challenging. One of the critical points was the Zionist Jewish settlement in the Holy Land, a controversial issue both at that time and today. In 1921, events occurred that still echo in the present, and to understand them, we need to go back to the 19th century in Europe and the idea of Zionism. During the 19th century, nationalist movements in Europe often excluded Jews, and in Russia and parts of Eastern Europe, outbreaks of anti-Semitic violence were common. After the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881, violence against Jews increased significantly, even though the assassin was not Jewish. Facing this discrimination, Jewish thinkers like Theodor Herzl began to idealize a national home where Jews could live in peace and security. This was the beginning of the modern Zionist movement. The Zionist movement initially considered several regions around the world as possible Jewish homelands, but Ottoman Palestine became the most popular option. In 1896, Herzl published the Jewish State, an attempt to find a modern solution to the Jewish question. In this book, he envisioned a sovereign Jewish state that would be formed through migration to Palestine or possibly Argentina. Although not all Jews supported Zionism, the movement quickly gained strength. Over time, the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine became increasingly attractive to many Jews, especially those facing persecution and discrimination in Europe. The situation in Palestine after 1918, however, was marked by tensions and violence. Britain, which controlled the territory, faced great difficulties in governing the region due to the growing Jewish settlement and the adverse reactions of the local Arab population. In 1921, these conflicts culminated in violent clashes, reflecting the deep divisions and complexity of the issue. To fully understand the conflicts in Palestine in 1921, it is essential to consider the roots of Zionism in the 19th century, the anti-Semitic violence in Eastern Europe, and the dreams and hopes of Jews to find a safe home. These tensions, which arose more than a century ago, still resonate in the complex dynamics of the current Middle East. Since ancient times, Palestine had received Jews migrating there, but before the Zionist movement, this migration did not have a national character. Most of these migrants were elderly Jews who wished to spend their final years in the holy cities. However, on the eve of World War I, there was a significant change. Young Jews identified with Zionism began arriving in greater numbers. These young people brought with them socialist ideas from Europe and began to form communal settlements known as kibbutzim. Between 1909 and 1918, about 40,000 Jews arrived in Palestine, almost doubling the Jewish population to approximately 85,000 people. This meant that Jews represented about 10% of the population, while the other 90% were predominantly Muslim and Christian Arabs. Despite the obvious tensions, some Zionists believed that the arrival of the Jews could also benefit the local Arab population. In 1909, the Zionist activist David Boron expressed this view, stating that Jewish immigration was not intended to harm the Arab community, but rather to help it overcome its economic misery, improve its social situation, and restore its physical and moral dignity. Boron believed that the Jewish Renaissance in Palestine would involve the regeneration of the country and its Arab inhabitants. However, many Arabs did not share this optimistic view. In 1914, the editors of the Palestinian newspaper Jafalistuj expressed their concerns, stating that the Arab nation was threatened with disappearing in the face of the Zionist tide overtaking Palestine. They feared being expelled from their own land and the destruction of their national identity. The explosion of European nationalism and anti-Semitism in the 19th century caused many Jews to seek a new home in Palestine, which had a majority Arab population. The outbreak of World War I interrupted Jewish migration for a few years, but British promises during the war paved the way for future conflicts. Between 1914 and 1918, the population of Palestine suffered from shortages and the region became a battlefield. In the last 2 years of the war, Palestine also became a focus of international politics, especially after the Balfour Declaration in November 1917. British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour sent a telegram to the Zionist Federation of Great Britain, declaring the British government's support for the creation of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. The Balfour Declaration promised that the British would do their best to facilitate the realization of this goal, but it also made clear that nothing should be done to prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, nor the rights and political status of Jews in other countries. This promise, full of good intentions, ended up becoming a catalyst for the conflicts that would follow, deeply marking the history of the region. The Zionist movement seemed to have gained the support of Britain. However, although some British ministers were sympathetic to the cause, the Balfour Declaration actually had a strategic purpose in times of war. Many Britons believed that Jews had significant influence in the United States and revolutionary Russia, and hoped the declaration would aid the war effort against Germany. Interestingly, even some British anti-Semites supported the declaration, hoping it might reduce the Jewish presence in Britain. Prominent British Jews, such as Chaim Weizmann, played a crucial role in obtaining the declaration. Weizmann, a chemist important for British war production, managed to convince Prime Minister David Lloyd George and Winston Churchill of the importance of the Zionist cause. The British government, however, had made other promises regarding Palestine. They discussed the creation of a pan-Arab state with the Hashemite dynasty, and also the post-war League of Nations mandates with the French. The attempt to solve this complex political puzzle took place at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. Weizmann met with Faisal of the Hashemite dynasty, and both issued statements supporting the Balfour Declaration. Faisal stated that the Arabs, especially the more educated ones, looked with deep sympathy at the Zionist movement. He assured that his delegation was aware of the Zionist proposals presented at the conference and considered them moderate and appropriate. Faisal promised to do everything possible to support the Jews and welcome them home. It seemed that both the Zionists and the Arabs might obtain what the British had promised them. However, this apparent harmony was brief. When the peace conference ended, British support for a pan-Arab state disappeared, and they took control of Palestine through the League of Nations. A U.S. commission concluded that the vast majority of Palestinian Arabs opposed Zionist settlement. Even so, British authorities began to act in accordance with the Balfour Declaration. Jewish migration and settlement in Mandatory Palestine resumed and expanded under the British regime, generating a series of events that would profoundly shape the region. Tensions increased with each new group of Jewish immigrants that arrived, and the climate of uncertainty and discontent grew among the Arabs. The stage was set for intense conflicts, and peace seemed increasingly distant. The promises and hopes that seemed clear during the conference began to dissipate, giving way to an uncertain and turbulent future for all inhabitants of Palestine. Between 1919 and 1923, about 35,000 Jews arrived in Palestine, many of them farmers from Eastern Europe. In 1920, the British reopened the old Ottoman land registry, once again allowing the purchase of land. As a result, Jewish settlers acquired large tracts of land, often with the support of international organizations such as the Jewish National Fund, the Palestine Colonization Association, and the World Zionist Organization. Throughout the 1920s, the flow of money from Jewish sources was, on average, 40% greater than the actual gross domestic product of Palestine. Land, however, was not cheap. During the Ottoman era, landowners registered land in the names of wealthier city residents to avoid additional taxes or military service, trading these lands for tools or animals for the peasants. Over time, landowners in Damascus and Beirut began selling their properties to Jewish settlers at exorbitant prices. Many of the lands purchased were sparsely populated areas or undesirable swamps. In September 1921, for example, settlers acquired about 70,200 square kilometers of the Jezreel Valley from the Lebanese Sursak family for £726,000 sterling. Within months, several settlements were founded, and the swamp was transformed into fertile agricultural land. However, other areas purchased by Jews were inhabited by Arab families who had been there for centuries. Socialist Zionists brought with them the ideology of Hebrew labor, which stipulated that only Jewish farmers could work the land in Jewish settlements. Hiring Arab labor was seen as a prohibited hierarchical relationship, further increasing tensions between the communities. The environment was fraught with uncertainties and discontent. Arab farmers saw their lands being sold and transformed by newcomers, while social and economic tensions increased. Each new land acquisition by Jews was viewed with distrust and resentment by the local Arab population, who feared the loss of their identity and traditional way of life. Thus, Palestine in the 1920s was becoming a true cauldron of emotions and latent conflicts. The constant arrival of Jewish immigrants, the drastic changes in land use, and the growing social segregation formed a scenario where peace seemed increasingly distant. Suspense and uncertainty about the region's future hung in the air as the Jewish and Arab communities prepared for an increasingly uncertain and conflict-ridden future. The Zionists implemented a system of segregation that dispossessed and evicted Arab farmers from their lands. Although some received compensation, many who refused were forcibly expelled, often by British forces at the request of Jewish settlers. Even pro-Zionist Britons and the mandatory government realized that these actions would inevitably lead to conflicts, as some legal officials had already warned. The new Jewish settlements established a policy of economic apartheid, which naturally strengthened Arab resistance to Jewish immigration. The British government in Palestine, theoretically impartial, in practice supported Jewish migration and approved laws that hindered the expansion of Arab lands. However, not all British leaders were in favor of this cooperation with Zionist organizations. Groups like the Zionist Commission worked closely with the British from the beginning of the mandate, while figures like Chaim Weizmann promoted the Zionist cause in London. Despite their efforts, they could not convince all British leaders to fully support the Zionist cause. The situation in Palestine became a minefield of tensions. Arab farmers saw their lands being taken and redistributed, often to newly arrived settlers who brought with them different visions and practices. Each eviction, each new law, each piece of land sold to the Zionists increased resentment and discontent. The atmosphere was charged with uncertainty and fear, with the Arab population increasingly concerned about losing their land and identity. Arab resistance grew, fueled by a sense of injustice and the constant threat to their livelihood. Conflicts began to emerge, first in small skirmishes, then in more significant disputes. The tension was palpable, and the region was heading towards an uncertain and potentially explosive future. Meanwhile, Zionist leaders continued their efforts to secure a national home for the Jews in Palestine, facing challenges not only from the local Arabs, but also from within the British government itself. The suspense mounted as the situation became increasingly tense, and the possibility of peaceful coexistence seemed ever more distant. Palestine was on the brink of a dramatic transformation, and what lay ahead was uncertain and fraught with danger. In March 1920, the chief administrator of Palestine, General Louis Bowles, expressed his concerns to British Prime Minister Lloyd George about Zionist activities. He complained that his authority and that of all departments of his administration were being disrespected by the Zionist Commission. Bowles highlighted that it was impossible to convince the Muslim and Christian elements of the population that the British promise to maintain the status quo upon entering Jerusalem was being upheld, as the facts showed otherwise. On the other hand, the Zionist Commission accused Bowles and his officers of being anti-Zionist, making the situation intolerable. He stated that it was impossible to please the Zionists, who officially claimed only a national home, but in reality sought nothing less than a Jewish state and all that it politically implied. Eventually, Bowles appealed for the revocation of the Balfour Declaration. However, his military administration was replaced by a civil administration led by the High Commissioner, Sir Herbert Samuel, in July 1920. Samuel, a British Jew and enthusiastic Zionist, declared that the British government's policy he was to implement was to encourage Jewish immigration until their interests were predominant enough to ensure the establishment of a Jewish government in Palestine. Samuel's arrival left most Arabs dismayed, as he was an openly Zionist British High Commissioner. In contrast, Zionist groups celebrated his appointment, and Chaim Weizmann even took credit for it, stating, "ZI was primarily responsible for Mr. Herbert Samuel's appointment to Palestine. He is our friend, and at our request, he accepted that difficult position. We put him in that position. He is our Samuel." Thus, by mid-1920, the pro-Zionist British government intensified cooperation with Zionist groups, such as the Jewish Assembly of Representatives, while denying similar access to Arab groups, such as the Palestinian Arab Congress. Palestinian leaders and intellectuals bitterly protested against British policy, pointing to the lack of progress towards the promised pan-Arab state. They felt that Palestine was being treated differently from other mandates due to Zionist interference. Tension grew as the Arab population perceived an increasingly uncertain and threatening future. Samuel's appointment and the clear alliance with the Zionists inflamed sentiments, and the sense of injustice fueled resistance. The situation in Palestine was becoming increasingly explosive, with imminent conflict looming. Suspense and anxiety permeated the region as everyone awaited the next developments in this complex and delicate issue. In August 1921, the writer Musa Kazim al-Husseini was part of a delegation that met with colonial minister Winston Churchill. During the meeting, al-Husseini expressed his frustration about the situation in Palestine since the opening of the doors to Jewish settlers. He reported that commerce was gradually falling into the hands of the settlers, who were devaluing the lands and properties and manipulating financial crises to force Arab landowners to sell at low prices. Al-Husseini questioned whether Europe really expected the Arabs to live and work alongside these new neighbors. He suggested that it would be better for England to find a country for the Jews in the vast uninhabited regions of its great empire. In response, Churchill reiterated that Zionism should also benefit the Arabs, but he made it clear that British policy would not change. The British government intends to fulfill the Balfour Declaration, he stated emphatically. I have told you this repeatedly, in Jerusalem, in the House of Commons, and I say it again now. We intend to bring in more Jews and will not allow you to prevent more people from coming in. In the early years of the British Mandate, there were improvements in living conditions in Palestine, such as in education, life expectancy, and agriculture. This also encouraged Arab immigration from neighboring areas. However, it is debated to what extent these improvements were the result of Jewish development, which was mainly concentrated in areas colonized by Jews. Conditions had already improved under Ottoman rule before the war, and many of the infrastructure improvements in the Mandate were funded by the British. Some Jews, like Yitzhak Epstein, born in Palestine, believed that material improvements could not resolve the discord with the Arabs. Epstein argued that while the Jews had brought considerable benefits to the local inhabitants, this did not compensate for the resentment of the Arabs who had been displaced from their lands. He highlighted the strength of envy and resentment among those who had lost their lands. The British administration eventually offered Palestinian Arab leaders the formation of a representative assembly with a Muslim majority. However, this assembly would be purely consultative and would have no real powers, which only increased the frustration and sense of injustice among the Arabs. Tension in the region continued to rise, with each decision and each action reinforcing the sense that a larger conflict was coming. The atmosphere was charged with uncertainty and fear, and the future of Palestine remained uncertain, with all sides preparing for what seemed to be an inevitable confrontation. In May 1921, a series of violent events shook Palestine, casting a shadow over the tense relationship between Jews and Arabs in the region. The Palestinians' refusal to accept the Balfour Declaration was a clear signal of their opposition to Zionism, which they viewed as a threat to their identity and territory. Meanwhile, the British seemed to ignore the Arab outcry, focusing on promoting the development of the Zionist movement. The accumulated tensions erupted into riots in February and May of 1920, but it was in May 1921 that the violence reached its peak. An incident in Jaffa, where demonstrators from different Jewish parties clashed, triggered a wave of violence that resulted in deaths and serious injuries. The presence of the British police was insufficient to contain the fury of the crowd, and the situation quickly turned into a massacre, with Arab groups indiscriminately attacking Jewish homes and families in the neighborhood. Reports of the events were contradictory and confused, with both sides accusing the other of aggression. In the chaos of the violence, clandestine Jewish defense groups like the Haganah sprang into action, further exacerbating the conflict. What began as a local dispute soon escalated into a large-scale armed confrontation, with reports of retaliation by the Jews. The presence of British troops, initially seen as a peacekeeping force, was questioned as the conflict intensified. The British soldiers, confronted with the violence and bloodshed between Jews and Arabs, found themselves in a moral dilemma, unsure of how to intervene to quell the violence. By the end of the day, the tragic toll of lost lives and injuries left both the Jewish and Arab communities in mourning and indignation. The senseless violence fueled fear and mistrust between the two groups, casting a dark shadow over the uncertain future of Palestine. Meanwhile, political leaders and colonial powers struggled to find a solution to an increasingly uncontrollable conflict. The turbulent days that followed saw chaos spreading beyond the confines of Jaffa. The attack on the Jewish city of Pak Tikva by a large group of Bedouins and Arabs was the spark for an unprecedented escalation of violence. The arrival of the British, with their reinforcements and even an airplane to interrupt the attack, brought brief relief to the region, but the cost was high. 47 Jews and 48 Arabs lost their lives, most in direct clashes between the communities and some at the hands of British forces. The Jaffa riots deeply shook not only the Jewish community, but also the British colonial authorities, who realized the vulnerability of Palestine under their mandatory rule. It was then that High Commissioner Samuel ordered the formation of the Hague Commission, an inquiry that lasted weeks and heard hundreds of witnesses. The Commission's final report pointed to both Arabs and Jews as responsible for the violence, highlighting Arab discontent with Jewish immigration and the pro-Jewish bias of the authorities. The epicenter of the turmoil, Jaffa, was a volatile mix of communities, with a significant Jewish presence and serving as the main port of entry for settlers. The report, while recognizing the complexity of the situation, emphasized the political engagement of Palestinians, noting that political discussions were a vital part of their daily lives. Reactions to the report were varied. While the Arabs received it positively, feeling that their grievances were legitimized, the Zionists were dismayed, as it undermined their narrative of peaceful coexistence between Jews and Arabs in Palestine. The outcome of the inquiry only heightened the tension and the fear that the conflict between the communities could escalate even further. Newspapers like the London Jewish Chronicle did not spare criticism of the British for their conduct of the inquiry. The analogy was striking, comparing the riots in Jaffa to the chaos of wild animals in a zoo, making clear the widespread discontent with the investigation. Samuel's temporary suspension of immigration and his conciliatory gestures towards the Arabs were viewed with suspicion by the Zionist community. Words of betrayal echoed bitterly among the Jewish settlers, especially as fears of new attacks and British abandonment began to loom. Tensions reached a peak when groups began stockpiling weapons in London, a clear sign that the settlers were preparing to defend themselves at all costs. The meeting between Lloyd George, Churchill, and Balfour with Weizmann in July brought some hope but also left many questions unanswered. British support for Zionism, expressed ambiguously, seemed like a fragile shield against imminent threats. The year 1922 officially marked the beginning of the British Mandate in Palestine, an era of uncertainty and instability. Churchill's vague promises about Palestine not becoming a Jewish land like England is English sounded like empty comfort to many. While Zionist organizations received almost governmental responsibilities, violence and instability in the region only increased. The founder of the Haganah, Ze'ev Jabotinsky, understood the urgent need to protect the settlers. For him, only behind an iron wall that the native population could not breach could Zionist colonization thrive. The sense that an imminent confrontation was in the air, and the Jewish community was preparing for the challenges that lay ahead. As days passed, tension in Palestine only escalated. Jewish settlers, aware of the imminent dangers, fortified their defenses and prepared for the worst. Meanwhile, Zionist leaders desperately sought to secure British support, knowing that their survival depended largely on it. Meanwhile, Arab Palestinians, feeling increasingly marginalized and threatened by Jewish migration and British support for Zionism, also prepared for what seemed to be an inevitable confrontation. Amidst this atmosphere of growing hostility, leaders emerged willing to take more radical measures. Jabotinsky, with his vision of an iron wall, he was determined to protect the interests of Jewish settlers at any cost. But at what cost? As uncertainty hung over the region, rumors of imminent conflict spread like wildfire. Both the Jewish and Arab communities found themselves on the brink, and no one knew for sure what the future held. In this emotionally charged and suspenseful setting, the destinies of Palestine's inhabitants were poised to intertwine in unpredictable ways, plunging the region into even greater turmoil. What tomorrow would bring for those who called that land home? The outcome of this story was far from clear, and destiny awaited with an anxiety laden with consequences. As tension continued to mount, the days dragged on in suffocating uncertainty. In the streets of towns and villages, whispers of conflict hung in the air as both sides braced for what seemed to be an inevitable collision. Jewish settlers, determined to protect their communities, fortified their settlements and stockpiled weapons in preparation for the worst. Simultaneously, Arab Palestinians gathered in secret, discussing resistance strategies and forming alliances to confront the perceived threat posed by the settlers and the British. Meanwhile, in the corridors of power, political leaders debated the next steps to be taken. Churchill, Lloyd George, and other British leaders convened in secret meetings, discussing the future of Palestine and the role of the British Empire in the region. Promises were made and alliances were forged as the interests of various parties clashed. In the midst of this whirlwind of events, individuals on both sides of the conflict faced impossible choices. Between loyalty to their own community and a desire for peace and stability, many found themselves torn, struggling to find a path through the impending chaos. Meanwhile, the world watched with a mixture of fascination and apprehension, aware that the outcome of the saga could shape the destiny of an entire region. In the hearts of the men and women who inhabited this turbulent land, hope and fear mingled as they awaited the next chapter of this still unwritten history. And so, as the fate of Palestine remained uncertain, the key players in this narrative continued to navigate their paths, confronting challenges and dilemmas that would shape the course of future events. As we eagerly anticipate the unfolding of the next chapters, we extend an invitation for you to join us on this journey. Don't miss out on any thrilling content and updates about the progression of this captivating story. Remember to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to closely follow the forthcoming installments. Together, let's delve into the challenges, achievements, and mysteries awaiting in this land of contrasts and conflicts.